Okay, I see we've got some attendees coming online now. Welcome, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders. I want to welcome you all to our monthly journalism webinar. This month, we're focusing on high-impact radio and audio journalism. It's a bit of a theme for us lately. We've been paying an awful lot of attention to the continuing relevance of radio and audio and the resurgence, really, fed by the interest and the energy coming out of podcasting and other streaming services. It's really been a sort of a rebirth of the relevance of radio. We're very fortunate to be able to share with you a new report on the topic. That's sort of part of our emphasis. And it was also a large part of our convening last week at our annual Media Impact Forum here in Philadelphia at the American Philosophical Society. I'm so glad that some of you were able to join us in person for that event, and we shared a lot of really great experiences there. All of that material will be available very shortly in digestible portions of live stream archives and things like that. But we just want to continue to dig into this focus of work because we do feel that it's such a rich area, and Sarah Armour-Jones, who led the research on radio and audio grant making, is going to really unpack some of that for you and to show you why it's still such an important area of work for us. I also had an article in the Current Chronicle of Philanthropy, which illustrates some of what we're talking about as well. So we're trying to boost the signal on radio and audio, and today's webinar is part of that. I'm going to let Fiona Morgan, our Journalism Network coordinator, moderate this discussion, and she'll introduce a couple of our speakers. I do want to just make one quick acknowledgement of one of our speakers today. Diane Kaplan, president of the Rasmussen Foundation in Alaska, is a very important voice in this area. She's a good old friend from a long time, but also important, I think, for us for two reasons. One, we don't get a lot of foundation presidents around these parts, so we really appreciate it when leadership steps in and engages with us in the conversations. Thank you, Diane, for that. And she also brings a wealth of experience, having led a vast network of public radio in Alaska, which is only about, a half the size of the rest of the United States combined. So she has a sense of the power and reach of radio in a very important place. I'm really looking forward to hearing her story. But with all of that aside, I will just logistically urge you all to, participants, to think about good questions and comments. And if you have them, to go to the upper left of your screen where you'll find the Q&A function. Type in your questions, and we'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the webinar to engage you in shaping this conversation. And with that, Sarah, why don't you take us through the data?
Sure. Thanks, Vince. Great to be here with you all and continuing the conversation that we had in Philadelphia. So I'm going to give you 2 points, and then I'm going to go over and share some slides. So the first is that radio is indeed thriving, as Vince alluded to, and audio is not yet thriving, but it's growing significantly. And I'm going to show you some data visualization that's going to make that very point. So I'm going to stop video and go to screen sharing. All right, hopefully you are now all seeing some pretty great charts that are showing that's happening in both radio and audio. So for radio, funding between 2009 and 2017 nearly doubled from 80 million to 150 million in 2017. And I should note that we really expect these numbers to creep up as more data is reported to Foundation Center. There is a little bit of a data lag coming in, so we expect those numbers to creep up. And for audio, funding tripled from 3.8 million in 2009 to 11.6 in 2017. And I want to point out that that drop in 2013 to 2014 is due to just a handful of bigger grants in 2013. When the funding levels are in the single million, multi-grants make a big impact on the bar charts. And so 2013, there were a bunch of big grants. Ford Foundation gave $750,000 to the New York Public Library. They gave $500,000 to StoryCorps. And in 2013, we also saw a nearly $1 million grant to Faith Comes by Hearing from the Enoch Trust. So there's a big dip there, but it rebounded really nice. And in 2015, it rockets back up. We start seeing several multi-million-dollar grants, including from the Denver Foundation, which has been a big funder of Learning Ally. And that organization serves people who can't read standard print due to blindness, visual impairment, dyslexia, and other learning disabilities and differences. And so one of the most interesting takeaways from the research that I did on audio and radio was the amount of usage of audio and radio for disability access and education. And that was really cool to see. And I think that we have some more opportunities to discuss that in the future. I'm going to go to the next slide, which shows the scope of funding in media content and platforms. And that's where audio and radio really resides. And, there's an interesting story to tell here. Radio gets more philanthropic funding than television. And I think that's a really interesting point. Radio picks up a lot of the funding gap that, CPB gives a huge amount in television grants and less in radio. And philanthropy really seems to be picking up the difference and making a significant contribution in radio. You'll notice that the tiniest little purple speck in the center is audio funding. So there's obviously huge discrepancies in audio and radio funding highlighted by this data wheel. And just a quick highlights of some interesting things that we found. Of the $970 million in radio grants, community foundations made $117 million, and public charities made $99 million of those grants. And another thing that was really interesting to us, the top 5 funders to radio gave just over $16,000 in grants, and Fidelity Charitable gave $15,110 of those. So they are making a huge contribution in radio. And it's not just in sort of small dollar donations. They had grants ranging from $1.3 million to $25. So I think, they are really acting like a community foundation in a lot of ways and serving radio in really significant terms. The primary areas of focus for radio include education, arts, journalism, public affairs, international development, health, and civic participation. And just for a fun fact, Amazon Smile Foundation directed nearly $150,000 in radio grants from Amazon customers. So I thought that was pretty cool. Audio highlights, let's see, 36% of grant money was received by just 2 organizations, Learning Ally, which I mentioned earlier, and StoryCorps, which received 200 grants totaling $12.4 million. On the theme of Learning Ally and support for people with disabilities, 1,300 of 2,200 grants were made for people with disabilities, totaling over $18 million. And on the flip side of that, 15 states didn't have a single organization that received an audio-based grant. So there's a real discrepancy. Radio has much more reach, much more funding, and audio is still struggling, but obviously growing. So I'm gonna stop that share and come back to say hi to you. There we are, hi. So I really just want to say that both formats are driving a lot of philanthropic experimentation and some really, really interesting work. There's, extraordinary opportunity across programming, extraordinary opportunity of reach. There's a low barrier to entry to both formats. And we heard some of that at the Media Impact Forum last week, talking about sort of community-based programming, community radio, and also obviously the democratizing aspects of podcasting and allowing people to really tell their own stories. So there's some really great work taking place. And I want to encourage folks who are interested to to both check out the report that has been linked in the chat, and also to, to look at the map. And if you have interest in learning more about some of the research that I found, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to help you navigate the map. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. People are doing some really great stuff and can serve as sort of valuable models for the rest of the community. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really great. I'm Fiona Morgan, and I'm the Journalism Funders Network Coordinator. And I just want to thank you, Sarah, for giving us that really great big picture overview. It's so fascinating to see across the country, across different platforms and formats, where grant making is actually happening and what the trends look like. Now we're going to dive into some of the, from the big picture to some very specific stories that I think are really powerful about how these investments make an impact in communities. And we're going to start with Judon Marshall, the Chief Content Officer for WFAE Public Radio in Charlotte, North Carolina. WFAE in Charlotte, Judon and I have known each other for a while, and we got to know each other, and I got familiar with the work of the podcasting and all the other reporting that they're doing in Charlotte through the work that I did with News Voices North Carolina. And the She Says podcast is a podcast that they launched that Judon will tell us about, that's had some really remarkable impact. And it also blends, they use the audio, the podcasting format, and also the radio broadcasting as well. So Judon, will you tell us a little bit about how She Says got started?
Yes, thanks for that intro, Fiona. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then talk through this. So as Fiona mentioned, we've been doing the She Says podcast we wrapped it up earlier this year, but we launched it in May of 18. Just for some context, we were able to do the She Says podcast and several other podcast initiatives through what I like to think of a Knight Catalyst grant. We reached out to Knight and made a pitch about doing podcasts to increase our engagement with mobile audiences, but also to deepen our involvement with the community and boost community engagement. And we were awarded $100,000. With that money, we hired a producer to help manage our podcast. We launched a community-driven podcast called FAQ City, an amplifier music podcast, and then we just did a huge community podcast call-out called our Queen City PodQuest. So She Says, before we get into it, two of our reporters spent a lot of time looking at sexual assault in Charlotte, mainly through the lens of one woman who had struggled for 3 years to bring some resolution to her case. The communication with the police department had dried up, and out of frustration, she reached out to us. We did some digging. We spent a year talking to her, and then our reporters dug through tons of legal documents, 3 years worth of police caseload data, and interviewed dozens of police officers, survivors, and other organizations to really make some sense of this. And so I'll let you hear some of the trailer for She Says to set this up, and then we'll get into some of the outcomes.
He made a comment and said, "This is where I bring everyone," and laughed. I just very uncomfortable at this point. Very uncomfortable.
On June 29th, 2015, a woman was sexually assaulted by a stranger in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's been nearly 3 years, and Linda has told her still wait for answers, even though she believes she's known the truth the entire time.
I said, I know it. I mean, there's just no question there, period, in the story.
The situation is so unfortunate. Half of my career is investigation. I've never seen this situation happen before.
And it's just been an absolute nightmare. An absolute nightmare. So I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't.
My name is Sarah D'Elia. I'm a reporter for WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source. And for about a year, I've been following Linda's story. And like you, I have a lot of questions. What can be done to improve this system sexual assault victims must learn to maneuver? And in Linda's case, the most pressing question, which has forced her to stay on this path: when will her perpetrator be brought to justice? During this series, we're going to look at Linda's case in a way that it hasn't been looked at before. We're going to talk to detectives, nurses, forensic scientists, and attorneys about how this system works and what needs to change. We're going to talk to Linda and hear tape recorded from her interactions with the police. And we're going to talk to you, because this story affects everyone, whether you're someone in the community or you've had a friend or a family member who has experienced sexual assault. Or maybe that person who has experienced sexual assault is you. In a world full of Me Too's, it may appear that justice is a swift one woman standing up, but there is a long and winding road to finding resolution. This is She Says.
And I pointed from like my head to my toes, and I said, "Does this look like consent to you?" He said, "This is where you may."
So that's just a snippet of the audio that we produced to tease people into the series. Out of this, we had more than 300,000 downloads of the podcast. It's been by far the biggest podcast we've done in terms of sheer downloads in that finite amount of time. It was listened to by people in 18 countries. We had a public conversation in which more than 300 people showed up. And what was remarkable about that particular discussion is in the audience that night, several survivors of sexual violence stood up and shared their stories in the room with police officers and detectives in the room as well. We had 12,000 subscribers to the podcast. It made the top 200 for Apple iTunes podcasts, which is remarkable because Apple has more than 500,000 podcasts on there. And then we just heard from hundreds of survivors who reached out through voicemails, through emails, through social media posts and tweets to let us know the impact that the conversation had had on them. And a lot of the focus of the podcast was about how police interacted with Linda, how they handled her case, and what could be done differently in terms of how they deal with survivors in gender-based or sexually based investigations. During the course, you hear in the audio the detective who's saying in her career of investigation, she's never seen a case like this before. And what she's referring to is that Linda had done her own detective work to identify her assailant and delivered that to police. And then through a series of events, they kept saying it wasn't him, it wasn't him. And DNA ultimately approved that the person that she identified was the person that she had some sexual contact with that night. And so at our public conversation, the police department made a public apology to her. They also told us that as a result of the series, they would implement what they call trauma-informed investigations. There was a lot of what they identified themselves as insensitivity in the way that they spoke to Linda. Linda had, out of her own frustration, had started recording all of her interactions with the police after a certain point. And so our podcast was able to leverage those recordings. And so the listeners could hear firsthand what that sounded like. The police department also changed the policy within their crime lab to ensure that detectives get more detailed information about DNA testing results. In this series, we talked about how one mishap sort of had the police officers misinformed about the outcomes of the case. And so they have addressed that since then. They also talked about streamlining a number of steps that they were taking to make their processes more efficient. And in the audience at the public conversation, several people said that they had not heard back from their own detectives. So on the spot, the deputy chief had police officers interview those women in the back of the room to take their names and to follow up. Another part that we looked at during the series was rape kits and reimbursements. We built out a public-facing database of more than 120 hospitals to determine who had sexual assault kits available. During those calls, we discovered that the state had stopped reimbursing many of the hospitals performing those sexual assault exams, which was a huge burden to the hospitals. Our podcast ultimately triggered an inquiry from the Justice Department. One of their attorneys was interested in knowing more and exploring whether the fact that they stopped reimbursement was violation of the Violence Against Women Act. And then shortly after that podcast episode aired about the lack of reimbursements, the state started reimbursing again and returning calls. And then lastly, one of the big impacts, and one of the biggest from my mind, is just the impact on our listeners. She Says had become, as of last semester, required reading in 4 classes at Queen's University, which is also based in Charlotte, where we are. A student from the University of Alabama reached out to our reporter to include her in a dissertation about podcasting and women. And then this quote, which I won't read to you, you can look at what's on the screen here, but it was just representative of hundreds and hundreds of pieces of feedback that we got from people. And the part that stands out to me is that this person had done all the initial steps, right? They immediately went to the hospital, they had their rape kit done, but they hadn't gone to the police. And so this one line where they say, you know, I haven't had the courage to go to police until I listened to your podcast. It was very powerful for us. And again, very representative of a lot of people who thanked us for sharing the story, who thanked us for giving them the courage to talk to their family members, to talk to their friends, to talk to law enforcement issues, because what we found over and over was that this was a very isolating event for a lot of people. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Judon. That is, I mean, when we talk about impact in journalism, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, that you can do with leveraging really, it was the $100,000 grant from Knight in addition to, is that right?
Yeah, it was a $100,000 grant. And out of that, we actually hired a person and then did the podcast production.
And, you know, in addition to the capacity and staff that you had within WFAE, which is a great station, but just that you can turn around and then produce reporting like this that can have such reach and impact to change policy, to prevent harm, to, you know, solve really systemic problems. I just think it's just such a great story. So thank you for sharing that with us. I want to encourage everyone who's listening and attending this webinar, please think of some questions or anything else that you would like to share, and feel free to share it on the Q&A. You should see a Q&A button, I think, on the upper right corner of your screen. Anyway, it's Q&A. My screen looks a little different than yours, but we would really love to hear from you. So please start writing those things up for us. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask Diane Kaplan, who's the president and CEO of the Rasmussen Foundation, to talk about her foundation's support for radio and audio. And Diane, as Vince mentioned, radio and audio have been part of your career for a long time, and it's also really part of the DNA of the foundation. Is that right?
It's true. Oh, yep. Sure. Okay. That's great. Sure. Go ahead and click. Hi there. It is. Actually, my first career was public radio. I went to college in Philadelphia and became involved right away with WXBN at the University of Pennsylvania. And it is public radio that actually brought me to Alaska. I learned about the Rasmussen Foundation very soon after arriving, and our radio network was growing. I was the 4th executive director in 4 years for this new network of radio stations. And our very first computer was a Rasmussen Foundation grant. Our very first digital tape recorder was a Rasmussen Foundation grant. Our very first, every piece of equipment that we started started with a Rasmussen grant. The foundation was very small at that time. And I want to tell you a little about our background and then how it relates to media. So the humble beginnings of the foundation are in Yakutat, Alaska. This is a photograph on the right of Jenny Olson and E.A. Rasmussen. They were 2 Swedish Covenant missionaries who arrived in Alaska in the very early 1900s, and that's the old mission house on the left. Yakutat was a Tlingit Indian village of about 500-600 people in 1901, and it's about the same today. Very, very similar community. Our foundation grew substantially in 1955 actually was started in 1955, very, very modest when E.A. passed away and his wife Jenny wanted to memorialize him in some way. Their son Elmer had gone off to Harvard and then was a protege of Arthur Andersen of the great accounting firm and learned about trusts and foundations. So that was what they decided to do. As you can see, we fund in all areas, very specifically in Alaska, and Health and Human Services has been an area of focus ever since we started. We have funded public media since the foundation started, but mostly equipment grants, small equipment grants like the ones that I mentioned. A little context about Alaska. We are a very large state, as Vince was mentioning earlier, and you can see the public radio network really covers everything in the state. If you wonder why there's no radio station in the upper area, it's because nobody lives there. Otherwise, there would be just mountains and tundra and so on. But all of these stations are critical, are very rural stations in general are the only radio in that community. Often there's no TV and no newspaper as well. And even in our largest city of Anchorage, which covers about half our population, the public radio station is the dominant radio station in the morning among adults. So it's very significant. And here you can see a map of Alaska across the United States. You can see it reaches from Florida all the way to California. So we're covering a vast area with very, very few people, only 700,000 people covering that whole area. So public radio, through the studies that we have done and others, is a dominant media in getting information out across the state. And of course, with very remote areas, often connectivity is an issue. So those public radio stations are really the backbone and operate in a really different way than most places in the United States, including FCC approval of doing point-to-point communications at times. So someone can actually send a message to somebody who's out on a fishing boat saying, Stanley, you are the father of a new baby girl, and things like that, which are not allowed in the rest of the United States to do point-to-point communications using public media. One of the things I want to mention is our foundation has always been very involved in public advocacy and public policy work. When our U.S. Senator Ted Stevens chaired the Appropriations Committee in the U.S. Senate, we approached him because we were concerned about the viability of these very, very rural stations and a lack of real interest in providing significant federal support for them through the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. There seemed to be rules and more rules created that would cut out Native American stations across the country, small, rural African American stations, and most of the stations in Alaska who couldn't meet the basic criteria. So through that, we were able to get intent language in the Senate that guarantees a minimum level of support for every sole service radio station in the United States, about half of which are in Alaska. So we have been steady funders of public broadcasting, and I wanted to focus on one of our grantees, Kawanak Broadcasting Corporation. We have supported them with over 44 grants over the years. They were created in 1992 to run the public radio Native American service and the satellite service that is operational there. Through that, a number of opportunities have come our way. If you recall, November 30th, we had a big earthquake in Alaska, and I've lived here 33 years. My husband's family has lived here 10,000 years. He's Elliot. No one that I know remembers living through a bigger earthquake unless they were here during the 1964 9.2 earthquake. So it was quite an event. And Kawanak Broadcasting was particularly hard hit. They are still dislocated from their services, from their location, probably won't be back in that building for another 8 months or so. And we were able to support them in that effort, along with the Knight Foundation, which stepped forward very early, and other funders. So that is something more recent. We also have supported Kawanak Broadcast Corporation's reach across the United States into Canada and now globally with their Native American content. They, in 2018, did something called Definition of Resilience, which was a native hip hop series. We've supported technical upgrades, expansion of their statewide radio service, and then you can see all of the stations that they serve across the US and in Alaska. We launched The River in 2018, an online music stream targeting a younger than the usual public radio audience. National Native News has been going for over almost 30 years at this point. It's based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and reaches across the country. And then a daily talk show called Native America Calling that also comes out of their Albuquerque studios across the United States. We really feel that giving access to the microphone to underserved groups is a great way to build understanding and minimize racism. We believe education and understanding is really the key for that. This is a view of a typical Alaska village. It gives you some idea of the remoteness in the communities. We are really pleased to support some new initiatives around Native election nights, reporting on elections in Indian country all across the United States. Kawanak Broadcast Corporation will be doing some significant work with the census, and they've been supported by the Carnegie Corporation for many years for their Get Out the Native Vote effort across the United States. And then every social initiative we have done has had a strong media content. And one of them around reducing the harm caused by alcohol in Alaska included a series called Day One of Personal Stories of Recovery, supported by the Doris Duke Foundation. And interestingly, that was Kawanak's first delving into doing video as well as their audio and radio. So in summary, just because of the scale and the scope, audio, radio are key. As Vince mentioned in an earlier conversation, one of our interns, who we call our fellows, young woman named Alice Glenn, has started her own podcast. She's probably the only Inupiaq Eskimo woman in the United States doing a very cool podcast aimed at letting people know more about life of her community and the people where she grew up, and that's growing and getting a lot of media attention. But we see radio really as the key, and we plan to do more to move not only our work in that area, but the field as well. Thank you.
That's great. That's so fascinating. And just how you've been able to support this national network of content that I don't think anyone could find otherwise. I don't think there is another way to find that level of consistent reporting and engagement with the Native American community. So that's amazing. Vaishali is with the James Irvine Foundation, and she's going to talk about the grant making that the James Irvine Foundation is doing for local public radio stations to provide local news and information in underserved areas of California. And while she's talking, I'm going to hand it over to her in a second. But again, I want to encourage listeners and participants in this webinar to please submit some questions to our Q&A or be thinking about what you'd like to ask when it's time for discussion.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and happy Friday. Thanks so much for your time. So I want to start with just a little bit of background. In 2016, our CEO, who was new at the time, changed the foundation's focus to building economic and political opportunity for Californians who are working but struggling with poverty. And at that time, our media grants were housed under our California Democracy Program, which focused on civic engagement. And that once that program came to an end, the media grants moved over to our communications department. And really our goal was trying to do more aligned grant making and support of media outlets to spotlight poverty, solutions, and really first-person stories of people who are experiencing and struggling with poverty. We also coordinated with our longtime program, our priority regions team. So that grant making focuses on parts of California, including the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, that face a lot of economic inequality and challenges, but those regions have far fewer philanthropic investment and fewer nonprofits, less infrastructure to sort of deal with all of the poverty in those regions. So we also do media grants that are focused on those communities. those regions also face, they're almost news desert. So there are some outlets, but there are very few kind of options. And so there, our goal was to try to support both the organizational sustainability of outlets as well as aligned content whenever it made sense for those outlets to be able to do that. So I think an example of some of those grants include Radio Bilingüe. They are a Spanish language station. They also do programming and broadcasting in indigenous languages. In many ways, I think Radio Bilingüe is really a lifeline for the community. Residents there are, again, have very little access to culturally competent in-language media outlets. And Radio Bilingüe, especially since about 2016, 2017, they have been doing rapid response reporting on the daily changes sort of in immigration policy, local ICE raids. They're providing information on workers' rights, really critical information that residents who are farm workers, other workers working in low-income jobs really are, need this kind of information. They also host public forums. And so residents are able to get a lot of really important information about just the basic needs and challenges that they're dealing with. We also work with Valley Public Radio, which is the Fresno NPR station. And as a result of their reporting, they actually were covering they did a series of stories about a very secretive ICE facility that was unmarked. The community had lots of questions about it. And as a result of their reporting, the ICE facility actually became much more transparent and open to the community. They actually marked the facility, and advocates in the area were actually able to start sort of interacting with the facility a little bit more. Valley Public Radio also did a story about Fresno residents lacking access to childcare credits that they were supposed to be getting. And again, as a result of their series of investigative pieces, it freed up greater childcare resources in the local community. So a lot of these grantees are having a huge impact. I think another powerful example I'll talk about is our work with Youth Leadership Institute, which recently absorbed YouthWire. YouthWire works with young people who are from the Central Valley and different parts of California, and largely they're coming from low-income communities, and they train them to be youth reporters. And so they get to work on the stories that are impacting them and their families. They work on the issues that are most important to them as young people. That's another, I think, goal of our grant making is we want to try to spotlight the direct voices of people as much as possible. And I think Youth Leadership Institute really equips young people to help tell them stories. We also work in major markets across California, including San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area. I think by contrast there, we're working a little bit more with direct coverage on poverty. So an example of that is we supported the KPBS station, which is in San Diego, and they were able to, as a result of our grant, establish a poverty desk. So another thing that we're trying to do is establish just a consistent drumbeat where people are regularly hearing about issues of inequality and poverty and solutions on a regular basis. And so that's, I think, a great example of trying to keep that drumbeat going. And I think those are just some of the examples that I wanted to share today. I'm happy to take any questions.
That's fantastic. It's so interesting to hear the resonance of these different themes about incorporating both people's direct stories in a form of empowerment so they can tell their stories, and also the reporting that can really uncover some of the systemic problems that are and directly affect people's lives. So thank you so much, Ashali. That's terrific. We do have a couple of questions, and so I'm going to start taking those, and I would just encourage everyone, including our panelists, if you would have questions for each other, other things that you'd like to discuss, let's put that in the queue as well. Let me start with just a quick question, which was, Diane, could you repeat the name of the podcast you mentioned that's being produced by your intern?
Coffee and Quack. It's called Coffee and Quack.
And how do you spell quack?
Q-U-A-Q. Q-U-A-Q. And it's something you eat.
Let me just jump in and point out Diane, we've actually linked in the chat to the Facebook post where we initially saw that from the Rasmussen Foundation. So people can click on that at some point, and we'll share all the links in a recap afterwards as well.
Great, thank you. There was another really great question from Crystal Haling. All NPR affiliates are not created equal. Can the panelists talk about the characteristics of established media outlets that ensure that they are amplifying voices of underserved communities rather than just reporting about those communities? So I think that's a cultural competency question, and also maybe a question about reporting with rather than reporting about. I'm wondering, Judon, if you have any thoughts about that, or really any of you.
Sure. So I joined WFAE 2 years ago, and part of what I did coming in, I was very intentional about wanting to add more diverse voices to our news reports, but also to empower the community to, help report alongside us. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was our FAQ City podcast. That's completely community driven. The community submits those ideas that they want us to explore. And then we invite the person who submitted the question to go out alongside the reporter and help report the story. And so if you listen to that, you hear the voices of the question asker interacting with the voice of the host as they explore that story and they talk about why they asked that question. And then one of the big things we've done, we have a local talk show here. And so we've really looked at, where we go into the same sources over and over to tell these stories, both in our talk show and in our reporting. Were we identifying the people most affected by the issue that we were talking about and making sure that they had a voice in those stories? We really challenged ourselves to think outside our comfort zones in terms of that. And we do a lot of public conversations. And so we've been more intentional about getting outside of our uptown area and really going to different areas of the community to sit down and have conversations in those places. And those have yielded a lot of good insights and results for us in terms of connecting with people who were outside our traditional NPR bubble. And then lastly, the big pie quest that we just recently wrapped up, we specifically did that as a way to identify both people who have not been as much as part of the conversation, and to give them a platform and some tools to be empowered to tell their own story. And out of that, we have more than 370 submissions with, that represented diversity across gender, across income, across ethnicity, ideas about issues that were important in the Charlotte community that they wanted to talk about. We let the community vote on which of those podcasts would move to a next round. And then we worked to train those podcast contestants to learn how to do this. And then after the fact, so we've chosen somebody who will move forward with us. But we've also said back to the community that we're going to do a series of webinars and workshops to teach anybody in the community how to podcast, because I really believe, I grew up in Hollywood, South Carolina, having been born in New York. And if you know anything about Charleston and Hollywood's position to Charleston, Hollywood is really impoverished. I'd never seen that level of poverty before. And even as a child, I recognized that there were stories in that community that I wasn't aware of until I moved there. And so my mission has been to make sure that we identify those similar circumstances in our listening area and that we shine a light, but that we also empower people to tell their own stories, because our resources are finite, right? So there are always going to be more stories to tell than we have the ability to do that. And so we want people with all the platforms they have to be able to leverage those tools and tell their own stories. And then lastly, Fiona mentioned how we met each other. We've also been very intentional about reaching out to other organizations in the community, not just other media, but other organizations that represent the diversity of the community, the needs of the community, inviting them into our newsroom to talk about Charlotte through their lens, but also going out into spaces with an organization like NC News Voices and hearing what people have to say to those third parties about their perceptions of news media and the issues in their community. And it's, it's been really rewarding for us to participate in that, but we're just getting started.
Thank you, Judon. Oh, that sounds amazing. And it really speaks to a lot of the power of these various kinds of engagement processes in the reporting and outreach that you do. And I'm wondering if our funders would like to speak to Crystal's question about the characteristics of established media outlets that ensures that they're amplifying these voices and serving the underserved communities. So from a grant making perspective, what would you be looking for to make sure that this audio and that the podcasting or whatever kind of work that you're supporting is going to do that?
I would say one of the things that was disappointing to me when I first joined Alaska Public Radio Network was finding out how much resistance there was to allow in the emerging stations operated by people of color into the network. And part of that is it was a zero-sum game at that point. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting received an appropriation, and if you added additional stations in, then the others who were already in got less. So there was huge organized opposition to allowing the new Indian stations, Latino stations in particular, into the network, and a few rural African American stations as well as rural stations. So all sorts of things happen. As I mentioned before, new criteria were put in place that became barriers, like you had to have five full-time employees, you had to be on 18 hours a day, your power had to be X, and so on. And finally, Senator Stevens took this up, because what would happen is every year when the appropriation process happened, all of the brown and red and black people at stations would be paraded in front of the Senate and House Appropriations Committees to show how diverse public radio was. But then when you looked at the lack of equity in how the funds were distributed, or even all the stations that received none, it was really unfair. And Senator Stevens took that up with his buddy, Senator Inouye from Hawaii at the time, and they basically gavelled out of a Senate appropriations hearing and said, until we get a more equitable approach, we are putting the Corporation for Public Broadcasting appropriation on hold. At that point, National Public Radio was the sole lobbyist for public radio. So that caused quite a swirl, and a big meeting was held in Washington, D.C. to try and negotiate a change in the formulas. And you'd find this interesting, Vishali. My one and only ally in that room was Hugo Morales, the head of Radio Bilingüe. We had met in California when we were trying to make the same kind of changes with the California Public Broadcasting Commission to open it up for new voices and media. And we were successful in getting additional funds allocated through the formula for stations that were operated by people of color, staffed by people of color, and whose content was aimed at people of color. Because up until then, all the money was distributed as a match to how much you already raised. So of course, if you're aiming at an upper middle class audience in Chicago, New York, or LA, you're gonna have a lot more donated money than if you were in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, aiming at that audience. So a lot has changed, but it came very hard, and a lot of people don't know the history, but it was a pretty ugly point in NPR's history, CPB's history, and now I feel those voices have been much more embraced. But still, if you go to the fairly new NPR building and go up on the 4th floor and look down at that newsroom, it's a sea of white, I have to say. There are a few exceptions, but I really feel with all these years there's been very little progress made in terms of the voices that you hear on mainstream public radio, and it's why Radio Bilingüe is so important, Kiwanis Broadcasting Corporation is so important, and the new media that allows much easier access and low cost access is so important.
I am learning a lot about the history, so I want to thank you, Diane. Also learning a lot about Ted Stevens that I didn't know. Vishali, you were going to say something, and I'm really interested in your response to this question.
Yeah, I think our approach has also been to go out and find the outlets and the projects that are directly highlighting and spotlighting people's voices, and working with them to help them establish media partnerships to help them get their messages out and their broadcasts out more widely. So for example, we work with Youth Radio. I'm sure many of you have heard their stories on NPR. They're based in Oakland. A lot of, again, the reporters are young people who come from low-income communities, communities of color. They're directly telling their stories and working on the issues that matter most to them. And then they have partnerships with NPR as well as other media outlets to broadcast those stories. So that's been one of our other approaches, is let's just go out and directly find some of those projects that are doing that direct storytelling and work with them, support them to help them get them the message out more broadly.
So, Fiona, I wonder if I could just jump in and pull a few highlights out of last week's forum that relate, I think, to Crystal's question to some degree. You know, we often think that public media is NPR, and that's not the only one. And even public interest radio doesn't necessarily have to be non-commercial public radio. So just two voices that led off our day, interesting different approaches. Peter Buffett, who is both the co-founder of Novo Foundation, but also in his role in communities where he has lived, he's established in Milwaukee several years ago, Radio Milwaukee, and now in Kingston, New York, where they live, Radio Kingston, which is a commercial radio, turned it into a non-commercial, and it's a non-NPR format. And then he was on a panel with Sarah Lomax Reese, who is the president of one of the largest and only African-American owned talk radio stations. And that's a commercial outlet here in Philadelphia. So there are a number of ways, and you can do, as funders, we can make grants to any of those kind of organizations. You don't have to be locked into the existing, you know, alphabet soup of public broadcasting as well. And then I would also just point out that it's a small world. So Diane, you came out of WXPN. We actually had WXPN on the program. They're leading a new music radio initiative called the Non-Commercial Music Alliance. And so among other things, just one vignette, WXPN has produced this amazing program on the gospel roots of rock and soul. And we'll put up a link to the programming there. It just shows that there are ways that the producing stations can work with different communities in their audience reach and create different programming that really reflects those communities as well. So those are a few highlights from the forum. And then I'll turn it back to Fiona to wrap us up.
Yeah, well, we have just about 8 minutes left here, and I want to again invite our listeners and attendees to please share a question. Meanwhile, I want to see if there are any questions that the panelists have for each other or other ways that they'd like to engage.
Fiona, I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So I'm curious to hear, you know, for those who have been working in and around radio and audio and, you know, Judon, particularly with the project you did and the extraordinary policy, you know, win and implications of your work. I always like to know sort of, what do you think is most needed in terms of types of funding support? Is it general operating? Is it experimentation? You might just answer yes and yes to that question, but really curious to hear sort of looking at the future of community engagement and sort of speaking to that question about not all NPR affiliates are created equal, and I really agree. You know, where are the levers? What are the pushing points that we need to get to that funders really should be hearing about?
Well, those are two great questions, and yes would be the answers. One of the things, and one of the reasons I want to go back to the Knight grant for it as an example is, you know, that was a $100,000 grant. It's not a small amount of money, but it's not a really large amount of money either. But when you look at what we were able to do with that grant, right, they allowed us to support operations by allowing us to go out and hire a producer who could help execute against this work. And then we produce, you know, 4 podcasts out of that have brought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to the table for us. And so, you know, we talked about She Says, but Amplifier, which is our music podcast that we did, you know, more than 400 people, local musicians in Charlotte, responded to that. We've had 3,000 plus people attend events around that podcast. We had a dedicated stage at a community-wide Charlotte Shout Festival just recently, where, you know, every day for 14 days you could come out and hear live music hosted by our podcast host and our podcast producer. So, you know, the combination of allowing us to really experiment, but also allowing us to cover operations, you know, that grant has paid, you know, itself in multiples in terms of its value to us as a station. Had I not had it, I doubt that we would be as aggressive in podcasting as we are right now. I doubt that we would have the sort of more diverse audiences that we've been able to attract, both in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of age. And so it's been really critical. And I would encourage all of the funders to think about really investing in experimentation, but also supporting operations.
Thank you. Diane, did you have something you wanted to add?
One of my pet peeves I've been addressing with my colleagues, and there's a group of foundations that do a lot of funding in the arts that meets a couple of times a year. Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation leads it. Rasmussen Foundation is the tiny little sister in this group of about 20 CEOs. But many of us have heard over and again on All Things Considered or Morning Edition, made possible by X Foundation, made possible by Y Foundation. So NPR gets a huge amount of unrestricted support from big foundations for its work, which of course is, you know, the most desirable money. But if you look at the support that Radio Bilingüe or Kiwanis Broadcasting get from foundations, it's always project specific. There hasn't been that general support just to support the networks, which they really scrape by year after year to get. So I've been trying to encourage my colleagues to think about, when they set aside funding for NPR, to do a set aside also for the Spanish language network, Radio Bilingüe, as well as Kiwanis Broadcasting, because generally there's very little overlap between their audiences and the main NPR stations, and it's a great way for those foundations to get their messages and their name out to a much broader American public. So I feel like I've made my first little progress. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is going to be doing a significant general support grant, and they have supported funding, health funding on both of those networks, but this will be the first general support, and I'm hoping that other foundations will follow suit.
Great. Well, we are almost out of time, and I want to see, Vaishali, did you have any last word? I want to hand the last word to you before we close out.
Yeah, I would just double down on what Diane said. We totally agree with that. We try to be as flexible as possible in our funding, and both we support, again, organizational sustainability. We're actually working with Radio Bilingüe right now to help them to support their succession planning and implementation and just overall sustainability. So I would encourage folks to think about being as flexible as possible. We try to set loose sort of parameters around aligned content when possible, but we're very cognizant of not putting stations, sometimes stations actually, it's tough for them to do a series. It actually ends up costing them more versus just getting that general operating support where they can be more flexible with both programmatic as well as operational funding. So I would just, put in a second plug for what Diane said.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Thanks for all these great stories. I think it was really rich. Thanks, Sarah, for the data, and you can definitely check out her report. And we will be sharing back with everyone who's registered here all the links from this conversation that we shared, and we'll also be putting up a recap on our website. Vince, did you want to say anything before we close out?
Well, just stay tuned. We're going to have a great webinar next month. End of the month, we are just tinkering with the calendar to make sure we get the right date, but we're going to be featuring all the journalism around the environment. And there's really, what we learned in the Shorenstein report last year was, in the categorical funding areas, environment led the way by a long shot. And so there's a wealth of opportunities to discuss there. We'll be digging into environmental journalism. And that will kick off really a year of programming around the environment as well. So stay tuned for all of that.
Great.
And thank you for an incredibly rich discussion today. Thanks, Fiona, and everyone on the panel.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.